Derek Chauvin is in trouble with the feds, and his case may be the template, may be the basis for all other cases against police officers, your local police officers during Joe Biden's presidency. I'm Andrew Esquire, and this is the Legal Mindset, where we teach you to be your own judge. Now, we went through the Derek Chauvin case in detail, and we had a lot of haters. We had a lot of comments regarding Derek Chauvin, and they got pretty spicy, but that's not going to cause us to stop. We're going to keep on going because the Chauvin story isn't over. Actually, we found out that the feds, the federal government, they were planning to arrest Derek Chauvin even if he was found not guilty in his state murder case, because he was found guilty on all three charges by the jury. Now, that will be challenged. There's possibility that there could be a second trial. That's still up in the air. But what we do know is the feds were going to get him. They were going to take him off the street to prevent riots. But what we had this week, this specific week, a federal grand jury indict Derek Chauvin and his fellow three officers that were there that day, on the day of the death of George Floyd, the ones that were at the scene with him. They were indicted by a federal grand jury. Now, what does that mean? What is an indictment? Well, you have to understand what the difference between a complaint and an indictment is. In the federal criminal world, when we're talking about federal crimes, especially felonies, there's due process under the Fifth Amendment. There's due process of law. There has to be enough facts to bring charges against you. So a complaint is just something that they file saying, hey, we think this guy is problematic. We think this guy, let's say, has drugs. He's created a crime, something else. And that gives them the ability to get a warrant and go arrest you. That's a complaint. It's just basic information about a person. But a grand jury, it's typically people from that district, and it's formed to figure out whether or not there's enough evidence to go forward with an actual jury trial, if they meet the basic evidentiary threshold to move forward with a trial. So this week, a federal grand jury found that there was enough evidence to move forward, not just against Derek Chauvin, but against his fellow three officers. And this is crazy, honestly. Why is it crazy? It's crazy because of the charges, because what they're actually charging Derek Chauvin and his fellow officers with. Now, they've got Derek Chauvin on excessive force, and that's probably going to be easy. They're charging excessive force for Derek Chauvin, and they're probably going to get that. I'll admit that. I'll let that go, because frankly, if you have a state jury convicting him of murder, they're probably going to get him for excessive force, even though Nelson presented experts that did show that force was reasonable under the circumstances, under the totality of the circumstances. But most likely, that charge will go the same way. But what is the other charge? What is the crazier charge? And the one that's not just against Derek Chauvin, but against all four officers, including Chauvin. That is unreasonable search and seizure. So every citizen is protected from unreasonable search and seizures. The cops can't just kick down your door, run into your house, and search your house and arrest you for something random. That's unreasonable. That's what happened under the Brits, and that's why we had the American Revolution, because the government went too far. And a lot of times we forget that. They're not allowed to go too far. But was it unreasonable search and seizure? Well, that's kind of funny, guys, because if you think about it, they had reason to stop him. They had reason to check him out. I mean, yes, it was a small crime, but it wasn't nothing. It wasn't like they just stopped him randomly because he was running down the street and they're like, let's get that guy because we want to be racist today. No, that's not what happened. We saw the video. We saw the whole video, including the convenience store video during the Derek Chauvin trial, which showed that he was acting weird and he had that counterfeit bill. And yes, it's a minor crime, but it's a reason to stop somebody. So it's not necessarily an unreasonable search and seizure. Now, they're also saying that the other officers, other than Derek Chauvin, failed to stop Chauvin. They failed to intervene. And that's a slippery slope. Because imagine that. Imagine that you're an officer who's standing there, and now you have a duty to stop another officer? That's kind of crazy. And you might be thinking, so these officers, these charges, well, Derek Chauvin already had a trial. Shouldn't that be it? Maybe you've heard of something called double jeopardy and no double jeopardy. And no, I'm not talking about the second round on Jeopardy where the points are doubled. No, I'm talking about being charged with the same crime twice. But you can be charged with a similar crime by both the state and federal government. That's called the separate sovereign doctrine. And actually, a couple years ago, when investigating a weapons charge in Gamble versus the United States, the US Supreme Court said, yeah, we're cool with the separate sovereign doctrine. We're A-okay with it. Now, what is that? Let me explain that to you. So in that case, in the Gamble case, Gamble, who was a convicted felon, had a gun, right? He was in Alabama. He was charged with possession of a firearm by a felon, illegal possession. And he served a year in prison for that under Alabama law. But he also entered into a plea deal with the federal government because it's a federal crime. And he served time for the federal crime as well. So he paid on both ends for a single crime. Similar for drug offenses. A lot of states make distribution of drugs illegal. Let's say you're passing bricks of coke. And no, I'm not talking about the kind of coke that's made in Atlanta, Georgia by a cute polar bear. I'm talking about the kind that's made by Pablo Escobar in Colombia. If you were distributing coke, let's say in the state of Florida, that's a crime in Florida. But it's also a federal crime. So you could be charged for both. You could sentence for both. And that's one of the reasons why the war on drugs was so damaging, because people served so much time under state and federal law for drug offenses. And that's something that may be corrected in the future. But what we might have here in the future, and why this is so crazy, is because you're seeing both the state and federal government go after these police officers. So let's say that you there at home, you are worried about what's going on in the world. You're seeing the riots. You're in, let's say, Minnesota, and you live in Milwaukee, and you see the riots. You say, I want to get out of here. I want to go to a southern state. I'm going to Texas. Texas, nobody messes with Texas. Let's say you have an incident in Texas. Let's say something goes down in Texas. And Texas says, look, we're okay with it. We're not going to bother with this issue. Well, the federal government might think elsewise. They might think that is a crime and prosecute you even though you're in Texas. And this can apply to your local police. So let's take those Texas police. Let's say they stop somebody. Let's say it's a video that goes viral. But state law looks at it and says, yeah, it's not a problem. Not a problem in Texas. The cops made a good arrest. It was something they're supposed to do. And Governor Abbott says, we're not touching it. Well, Uncle Joe Biden, he could come down and say, hey, we think that's a hate crime. We're going to prosecute that. We're going to say excessive force. We're going to say unreasonable search and seizure, just like they're doing with Chauvin. And they could be coming after your local cops. So in that way, nobody is safe. Nobody in the US, no matter where you are, is safe from this federal prosecution. And we talked about this, and it's so important you look at the executive orders of Joe Biden, because those executive orders, what he's put down, clearly put equity and social justice as the number one issue, including police reform. You've really got to look at all of those executive orders. So check out my video on Biden's big mistakes in executive orders.